All right, part two, the journey continues. We're going to start with the topic of hazing and adulthood and rites of passage and getting the crap beat out of you as you're trying to become a creative or become a great thinker or whatever. So
sure thing.
Alex was just going to tell a story about when he was I'm a Robot. Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, as the Air Force passes over my head, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, you're fine.
So my very first review in Rolling Stone, which of course I was excited about, I was young. The first line, I open the page, "Welcome to the newest, most annoying voice in rock and roll."
Great start.
So here's where that ties into freak theory, if I may, because I'm fucking autistic with this right now.
Yes.
But I needed to get, that hurt. That review stung. That was my first initiation into that type of pain, right? In my adulthood, for my art, something I poured, I had to get more bad reviews and more bad reviews and more bad reviews and more bad reviews until I developed a thick, continuous solidity, as Bard called it recently, of skin as my new equilibrium, so that I didn't fucking care anymore. It ended up liberating me.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
No, absolutely. Like I've never been as prolific as you have been, but I mean, the journey to become a successful writer is based on rejection. And I think the only way to become successful is through handling that rejection. And like, I think frequency is a great metaphor for it, because you learn to ride those waves and then suddenly you find something that's working for you and the rejection stops mattering because you're so used to it. Like, just like you was describing it earlier through, and I thought that was a beautiful metaphor, through like the only way to get through sadness is through really diving into it.
Completely, yes.
Yeah, that's Jung's whole thing, right? I mean, partly like neuroses is what we avoid, so don't avoid it.
No, but Jung's perspective would be don't avoid it.
Exactly.
Enlarge yourself. So that's the big difference between cognitive therapy and depth therapy. So like the whole cognitive school of psychology is, okay, let's compartmentalize this aspect of like your depression, and let's try to find ways of thinking which is not connecting you to that. The Jungian school is completely opposite. Let's dive into this and become larger so we are not affected by it anymore. And
that's how you avoid neuroses, right?
Absolutely.
Because you dive into the you almost sort of, the concept of, I like this metaphor too. I don't use it that much, but maybe it's the best metaphor for an equilibrium, is a noise floor. In quantum mechanics, they call it quantum noise. It's just this static.
Yeah.
Can't get rid of it. And no matter, and you've been to a studio, they put up the foam and they try and get everything isolated, but you never get rid of the noise floor.
No.
It's all about the noise to floor ratio. And so these new equilibriums become our background noise, our noise floor, on which we build our new selves. And so we're so used to the rejection, it becomes like distant static that makes us stronger, that now we can create these new oscillations about.
But this ties into stuff that Alexander Bard talks about sometimes in terms of infantilization of society and the lack of basically. So the idea that we basically are seeking to hide under mommy rather than to actually face these very difficult feelings and emotions and challenges. Mastery of anything has always been about how many levels of hardship can you withstand so that you can survive at that next level of constant stress and pain. And so I think a lot about Kung Fu, for example, and the fact that Kung Fu is really just about discipline. And so the whole idea is that to become a master of Kung Fu, you have to be able to withstand heat, cold, hunger, humility, every different kind of suffering. And the thing is, not everybody gets to the top. It's not for everyone. And most people have a level at which they jump off. Okay, that basically they say, like, this is the level of mastery that I can attain, is roughly equivalent to the level of suffering that you can withstand as your baseline.
Completely
And
agree.
that's been
Completely
my
agree.
experience with artists and my experience with professors and my experience with the real grandmasters are withstanding hundreds of times more intense frequencies of emotions and ideas being and another point on this part, Alex, I've noticed that like I could look at your most beautiful performance, your greatest video, and you can go through the comments and there's some person who always has to like burst that bubble and be like,
Oh yeah.
I liked you better on the first album.
Oh yeah.
Like it doesn't matter, no matter what level of greatness you would
No.
someone didn't notice, you know?
No.
But you brought it up though. No.
You know, so as a reader, Alexander, what do you think? Have you ever, like, so not just as a reader, but generally in the arts, have you ever just been said, you know, there's this like mastery level of art and only some people can see it?
Well, it's as you're saying, it's through suffering. Basically, the only way to become better at something is accepting suffering, because you're never really where you want to be. You're always seeking the next goal. So it's through, like I always say to people who want to become writers or people who want to make a living of music, if you can do anything else, please fucking do anything else, because like it's a massive fucking struggle and you have to accept that struggle. And I think people also do that in other aspects of life, but like basing your whole career on just rejection is absurd for most people.
Oh yeah, and so as teaching entrepreneurship, rejection is the biggest part of the job.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I build in or bake into my course is I basically tell students from the very beginning, no matter what you propose to me as your idea in this course, it's going to get rejected, 100% rejection rate.
And that's a really good thing. And that's a fantastic thing.
Because that's reality, that basically, like, you know, the greatest companies you've ever heard of had to revise their business plan 50 times. Back to, you know, like basically go back to the drawing board so many different times just to get through. And the thing is that supposedly, like, as you're on that path to mastery, each time it hurts a little less because you know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, or basically there is. I remember, Alex, I remember what it was when you said Heath Ledger, like his distance from ideation to actualization was like this. Well, how did he get there? You know, to get to that narrowness of difference between ideation and actualization, it took how many cycles? You know, so that's a big part of what I think about when you talk about frequencies and waves, is that basically not only is it just a matter of higher and lower levels. This is one of my critiques of people who always assume, like with integral theory, it's like next thing is the higher level, and then that's better, and then we're at higher resonance. And I'm like, I kind of think about it. I do not think about
it. Becomes more difficult.
Right.
Yeah, but you also, in a sense, like, and this is an old adage, so it's like an old cliche, but writing is rewriting. So in some sense, you have to accept that the first like static of noise is going to be terrible, and it's through reworking it that it suddenly becomes a thing.
Yeah.
But like, if you don't, like, I've been writing since I was 12, and I only became good at it because I had deadlines. So when I started working professionally as a writer, I suddenly had to finish shit, because like, if you're only looking at the single static, then oh, this is not good enough. Okay, I'll create a new one. But the only way to perfect something or have mastery over it is through reworking, through the constant rejection of what you're putting out there, and then create like a dialectic with your own work, so it becomes a thing in itself.
Have you ever had a mentor that you watched fail?
Oh yeah.
You know, it's like that whole, we always imagine that like, the Zen master never fails, you know.
No.
But it's such an interesting experience when you're like, here I am alongside this world-class creative or a writer or intellectual, and here I am watching them make lots of mistakes.
Well, I think that was actually my experience. Like, whenever I worked with somebody I really looked up to, all I saw was their mistakes. But what inspired me was their perseverance to overcome their mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's that. Well, I won't share this story. Actually, my girlfriend will be upset, but that's a big part of it. And I just want to share this quote by George Orwell because it just came to mind. Writing a book is a horrible, exhausting struggle, like a long bout with some painful illness. One would never undertake such a thing if one were not driven on by some demon whom one can neither resist nor understand.
Yeah, that's a beautiful quote.
Yeah.
That's very similar to a quote I recently heard from David Bowie. Okay, so there's this great little video about creativity that a clip that he put out, and he said something similar. Where he said, do you enjoy the creative process? He says, it's not like sex, which you just genuinely enjoy. He said, he's like, I get angry, I get frustrated. He said that basically, maybe that's just me. He said, but I spend most of my time in the creative process almost like it's the birthing process. It's mostly pain, anger, frustration. And it's just like the birthing process. It's like, I gotta get this done. Like, I can't stay in this in-between state forever. It's more of like the pain of pushing it through. And Bowie also said on the Orwellian, that point, basically said, the most rational thing for a human being to want to do is to provide a safe and loving environment for their friends and their children, and to raise and nurture and to help each other and to do all these rather nurturing things. He said it's actually bonkers to want to go be an artist and to put your ego out there and your will out there on the world. And he said, does the world really need 1,000 different colors of dinner plate, or does the world really need 10,000 different colors of jacket? But we have people who insist that this is their calling and they're going to make another jacket or another dinner plate or whatever. And so what he said is like, it's a bit mad, but on the other hand, he didn't say that's bad. He described it as like all the icing on the cake of life. So it's the extras. And he said, there's some people who live entirely in the extras. Their entire experience is trying to solve non-survival problems, which basically means everything that, not to cheapen the spirit, the soul, and all the things that the artist speaks to, but on the hierarchy of needs, these things become infinitely more important when you have time to think on them or reflect on them.
Well, there's an aspect of schizophrenia in it, and I don't mean the modern definition of schizophrenia. I mean like the old school definition of schizophrenia, which means being outside of like Deleuze, schizophrenia and capitalism. The old school definition, where it means being outside of the society, because to take a bow and then take a gut from a fucking animal and decide, well, this would be a nice way to make music. That's not helpful. That's not helpful necessarily directly from the tribe survival perspective.
Oh yeah, so just like sociopathology was a mental disease of the warrior, very much schizophrenia was the mental disease of the shaman, So,
exactly, yeah, exactly.
So without going too much down that rabbit hole, I wanted to circle back to like the core topic, which was basically understanding how do we, okay, so here we find ourselves in 2021, and a lot of people have been looking at the world as being incrementally going off a cliff, right? So you have doomers who basically see the environment as incrementally marching off into oblivion. You have people who are screaming about, we need post-capitalism. We've been arguing for post-capitalism for 150 years and we're still not there. And so we see the world going off a cliff in terms of inequality. And so there's a lot of people who have this doomer attitude recently, and there's a lot of good reasons to point to external events that are troubling our psyche. To me, that's why people need a more oscillating or cyclical kind of understanding of history, a long view where they can say, no matter where we are now, this isn't actually the end. There's actually a beginning in every end. And so before I ask question, I've had a lot of people tell me that their frustrations with the intellectual dark web, and you guys know who I'm talking about, people like Jordan Peterson, people like Joe Rogan, people like even going back to Christopher Hitchens and some of these other folks they're very much heavily in a critique or problematization mode, where they basically say, we don't want to go into radical leftism or radical authoritarianism or all these basic wrong paths, right? But they don't know where we should go, right? And so I've also had people tell me a lot that Daniel Schmachtenberger frustrates them endlessly because he keeps talking about sense making. But whenever anyone says, okay, now where are we going? He's like cleverly dodges the question. So to me, my way of answering this question, why do we need freak? Why do we need harmonic oscillation theory? Why do we need a return of archetypal thinking, for example, is that it provides some direct answers about the next.
Absolutely.
It's not a dodge. It's not a critique. It's not just a critique on top of a critique on top of a critique, which was the postmodern problem, And so the real thing, though, is that if we're talking about emergence, we need to basically also we're helping other people who want to create emergences to know how to do emergence. So that's why I think it's important. Because there's people who want to know, who want to create the new things, and they're saying, "Give me some recipes, ideas, or how do I get started?" And so that's why when I want to know what you guys think about that. Alex, what do you think?
I feel largely the same. So I view the current sense-making paradigm as shoring up justification models, the consilience of justification models, which can modulate and mitigate sort of, distorted oscillations, things that may, whatever, but
cleaning up old paradigms, making old paradigms tidier.
yeah, exactly. And I think that I think they're missing something rather fundamental, which is that the very reason why we're having a sense-making breakdown is not necessarily strictly due to technological advancement that's facilitating like a constant of chaos in the human brain. It's a very actually sort of, elitist position to want to just shore up sense-making and then everything will follow beneath it. I think at bottom, there's a rather genuine and rational distrust beyond postmodernism. I mean that we as a society know that something is wrong.
Yeah.
And that we know that many of us know there's something wrong with a number of the paradigms. Many of us think that the economic paradigm itself and the way that it compels us to behave, there's something wrong about it, that there's something upside down about it. And one thing, going back to Jung for a second, that's very important, and going back to definition, is that, this is just a little side theory of mine that I, call avoidance theory. But the whole premise of neuroses is that if you avoid something, it becomes a neurotic function.
Yes.
So if we look at capitalist,
it starts to define you. So, for example, if you have a phobia,
yes,
the more that you feed it, so we talk about negation sometimes. You're basically creating this thing that basically is the negative force driving your life, and it becomes larger and larger.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that I think probably capitalism itself, with its emphasis on nonstop growth, and then Western society following capitalism, with its emphasis on nonstop youth,
right?
What we've ended up with is a negation of death. And the only other thing that I can find in biological life that tries to negate death is cancer. Apoptosis is refusal of apoptosis is programmed cell death. The thing that defines cancer cells is their refusal of apoptosis. Their refusal to die is what defines a cancer cell. They won't die when they're supposed to. And I just find that parallel interesting enough to sort of consider that one of the things we shouldn't do as sense makers is name our movement Extinction Rebellion. One of the things we shouldn't do as sense makers is focus really heavily on anthropogenic risk and drum up enough fear to make the change. Instead, what we should be doing is embracing our death, confronting our death, and thereby remove our compulsion to behave extractively, to behave like cancer. So that if we embrace death, we will stop behaving cancerously and extractively and counterintuitively solve the problem. So I do have that like major criticism.
Yes, and so from my background in business, one of the first, my mentor, so I went to University of Pittsburgh, which at the time that I went there was a top 5 business ethics program, and I was going there to do business ethics. And of course, interestingly, they canceled the business ethics program the year I got there because there was an ethical debate internally to the organization, and the ethics professor said, we're out of here because you guys basically are not going the right path ethically. And so the ethics professor scattered. And so one guy was basically left standing who was one of the old guard. And, you know, I ended up working with him. But the thing was, one of the key things that we discussed was that organizations do not want to die when they are supposed to. Okay. It's funny that you mentioned that because that was a very popular talking point at that time. We were saying, look, when you have this sort of scale problem or growth problem in capitalism is largely built on the idea that, you know, organizations were originally supposed to have missions, okay? And so that, and this is true in the NGO space as well, which it says, here's the mission of our company. When you achieve the mission, you're done, okay? Theoretically speaking, but what these organizations did to create themselves as permanent centers of power is to perpetually rewrite the mission and kick out the people who don't move with the transformation of resources to the new leadership. So this happened, for example, in Apple. This is a classic example. So you have Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak start this revolutionary company trying to create open systems originally. By the way, I'm doing an interview with Lee Felsenstein's student, who basically was the guy who invented the concept of open systems on computers and was the head of the Homebrew Computing Club. I've been dying to interview him, and he said yes, so I can't wait. But Wozniak wanted to be him, okay? So that's how big he is. And he's still alive, so I got to get him, you know, and he's actually alive and kicking. He's trying to actually do what he did at that time in the biological revolution in the current business age today. And so I can't wait to pick his brain on that. But anyway, like, so the idea was that, you know, you have this Promethean kind of organization that was trying to do something radically cool and important and morally deep. And then what happens is it reaches a limited scale of people who understand the vision and agree with that. And so in order to scale it to the masses, they have to kick out all of those principles and replace them with systems that are perpetually evolving in terms of what their moral mission is. Tristan Harris talks about this with Google. I don't know if you're familiar with Tristan Harris, but basically, like, he said the same thing. He was the original chief ethicist of Google, and he got pushed out because his ethics weren't evolving quickly enough to keep up with what they wanted to sell. And so over and over again, we see this story of large-scale organizations pushing out anybody who's true to the ethical mission. And it's disgusting. It's horrid. And so, so it's funny that you mentioned that. And it's also been mentioned that one of the ways to solve that is to keep everything small, but you know, have these big networks of smaller organizations that.
Or have temporal expirations. Like one of the best thing that Consilience is doing, in my opinion, is that they are capping their lifespan at like 3 years, I think, or 5 years. And that's a nice, but that's almost the story to me. It's like, you know, and capping workforce and all that, I think, you know, would also be an aspect, but but you know, it's not a bad thing. Like, so for instance, in the free theory model, like at first I was looking at these waveforms and they're all collapsing and condensing and becoming non-dynamical, and that looks like a flat line. And so I'm thinking death is bad. But when I think of that flat line as the equilibrium for the next evolution,
Mhm.
it positivizes the whole notion, so that instead of thinking, it's so bad that the dynamism of this moment collapsed into this other thing. Well, yeah, they collapsed so that the next revolution or the next instantiation of inspiration could occur.
And Alexander, I'm going to speak to you for a second. So,
Sure. I have a slight comment on that as well.
yeah,
But I think it's basically the difference between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, where Schopenhauer's perspective is the drive towards death, and Nietzsche's perspective is the idea of the eternal return or eternal reoccurrence. So I think
They're both the case. It's both.
There's both, but I think like when we are talking about our society now,
depressing. It's true.
well, it's interesting in different ways. But I think like what we are looking at is that humanity really hasn't changed. We are still pretty much the same thing. But because our technological paradigms are changing, we are reinventing ourselves in some sense. So it's not because our problems are new, but we are experiencing them in a different paradigm. So like if you have a tribe, let's go back to the nomadology of the tribe, the Dunbar number of 160, 56 people or whatever living together. It wouldn't be unnatural to have some people who are more focused on, like, let's say, the well-being of the internal social structure, and other people who are more focused on, let's say, the entire structure of where we are going. And that's like the difference between, like, let's say, socialism and capitalism. The difference is that we have changed that to a paradigm where we are so removed from where it used to make sense that we are battling each other instead of understanding how we need both things. And that's why I'm a big proponent of new paradigms making the old paradigm die. So right now we are in the end times of democracy. Democracy has become pathological. Like you can see it. It has stopped to make sense. Like we are just like hating our leaders, and they're not doing anything for us. But luckily, the new kingdoms are arising in the digital. And then we will start over again. So we will start with the kingdoms of the technological empires, which right now are like Facebook and Twitter, and they're going to be tyrannical at first. But then the market is going to come into it and start to decentralize that process. And we're going to have the same problem again, like time is moving faster and faster. So it might happen within like a generation or two. But that's how we are evolving. We are telling the same stories again and again, but as Edward's frequencies theory.
Well,
like, we're going to a place where it's going to make sense because it happens faster and faster. It's like the new paradigms are coming at a more rapid pace.
Sure, but if you magnify your story, down to just a phase shift from capitalism to whatever the next, digital kingdom thing is.
Attentionalism and digital, I think.
Sure, and you look at that. The thing that I always want to stress is your notion, so I don't think we'll be in disagreement here, of subsistence. That the collapse of capitalism, becoming the equilibrium for the next oscillation of the digital kingdom, subsists as the equilibrium, as the noise floor for the next oscillation.
Yeah, and that's why I also this is not my concept, but the implicate order, which is what is carried on to the next level. Yeah, same thing. So what I think is like, and this is tied into what's called novelty theory, or the idea that new events happen faster than the last one. So like you have zero, and as you say, but zero also means one, but one also means two. And then suddenly like relationalism is exploding out of that, but it happens faster and faster. So what we are seeing now is that the next revolution, in that there's going to be a revolution already happening. And when that happens, we're going to have equilibrium, because that's what equilibrium is.
So
that is the revolution recognizing itself.
Yeah.
The change recognizing itself, that creates equilibrium.
Yeah. So, I know that it's very popular to talk about sort of the exponentiality of speed and time and information. However, I've discovered many counterintuitive facts in this conversation. So like, I talked about this with Schmachtenberger, and for example, and by my research, paradigms in terms of the dominant paradigms of major institutions are moving at the same speed that they have since pretty much the beginning of civilization. And it's really not changed much at all. Here's
explain the Middle Ages then.
Oh, no. Like Peter Turchin did a study of the Middle Ages and found that the oscillations around war and cultural pressures were very even for the entire stretch of the Middle Ages.
But
So there's very, very powerful evidence that at the top of the world system down, things have barely changed in thousands of years in terms of the pacing and the structure of the world system. What you're talking about is the pace of innovation. So the pace of innovation has accelerated, no doubt, but that doesn't actually mean that the dominant paradigms are being challenged any quicker or to any greater degree. And here's why. We're having a power law difference in the power of the innovations that run the world versus every other innovation, which is very similar to the power law difference in wealth, okay? So what happens is that it takes 50 years for the great nations or the great powers to actually change their political arrangements in any significant degree. And that means that the ideas that they promote in that dominant paradigm are relatively stable despite all the noise beneath it. Okay.
Absolutely.
So let me ask you a question.
This is a fundamental, but I just want to say this is a fundamental argument for systemic thinking. Anyway, I'll just pass it on. But in other words, the whole woke notion or any notion of focusing on what Marx might call the superstructure as opposed to the base level of power. But all of that sort of superstructural stuff does not necessarily affect the base oscillations and functions of power. Those move much slower.
Right. Yeah. So for example, since the first industrial revolution, so Carlotta Perez, who's somebody that has heavily influenced my own economic work, she's an economist who's currently at London School of Economics, which is also the same place where David Graeber was and so forth. It is the #1 school in the world for what you call heterodox economics. And she is what you would call a neo-Schumpeterian economist, which is what I am when I do economic work. And what that is it's the study of paradigms basically within economics. And so basically what she saw is that there have been 5 techno-economic paradigms since the first industrial revolution. And I've seen people try to tell me that basically, paradigms are coming faster and harder. And no, not in the slightest, because I can tell you on the rhythm who did what when to create the new paradigms. And I'm going to, like I said, Lee Felsenstein, who actually was one of the creators of the digital age and the digital paradigm, he was one of the most key figures in the world for doing that, believes the exact same thing as what I'm saying, is that it took 50 years for the new paradigm to start emerging, which is happening right now. And he's on the ground with the people trying to make that happen.
Okay, so let me ask a question.
The same interval of time as it has been since the first industrial revolution.
So let me ask a question. How do you define paradigm shifts?
That's the important question, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Because I think our definitions are different. Because like if you take like a Marxist perspective on it, you would describe it through power structures. And in that sense, I would largely agree with your perspective, but I believe that power structure difference is based on something inherently biological, which it can also be seen through the Pareto structure. My way of defining paradigm shift, as opposed to Marx, is not through power structures, but through technological shifts. Well, so I would say they are happening at a faster rate.
Power structures. So that technological shifts are also power structures, according to.
Well, you can say that like the feudal system to the industrial system to capitalism happened rather quickly, rather at a faster pace than monarchy to the feudal system, for instance.
I
think-
entirely-
So that's like we
I
can't
think
even.
But I think that
That's not arguable. Would you agree?
I'll draw you the chart from the beginning of history to present. And
But you had like systems, like you had systems that lasted for thousands of years, and
Yeah.
within like the last 200 years, you would have massive technological changes,
Sure.
which like I agree with you. I understand your perspective, but what I'm challenging is the way that we define paradigm shifts in the first place.
Okay.
I think I just want to say that it's fairly subjective. So, for instance, like there's a lot of truth to the idea that after slavery, it was just replaced with slave wage labor, and nothing fundamentally different at the fundamental base level of power and their operations changed. And yet, a massive paradigm shift happened culturally. So there's different ways to sort of characterize paradigm shifts.
That's my point.
It just depends which way you're looking at it. You know what I mean?
I totally agree with that. And it's not because I'm saying you are wrong, but I just believe that I believe there's an inherent fallacy in understanding history through power structures. Because I believe that those
That's a whole different conversation.
Well, it is, but
that's a massive conversation.
It is.
We're on exact opposite poles on that, because basically world systems theory is inherently about studying the world through power structures.
Well, I completely understand. That's the Marxist tradition. My tradition of understanding paradigm
tradition.
It's not only a Marxist tradition.
Before Marx as well.
It absolutely did, because when we are talking about like different times in history, we're describing them through the power structures at that given point in history.
We're literally out of time. It's going to cut off.
Okay. My argument